The Third Hand of Hate, South Africa's Xenophobic Surge and the Politics of Strategic Scapegoating. Part 1, Historical Context, Political Economy, and the Emergence of Xenophobic, Afrophobic or Anti-Immigration Politics. Introduction. South Africa stands at a precarious crossroads. 3 decades after the dawn of democracy, the nation that once embodied the hope of African liberation and the promise of a rainbow nation, is once again grappling with a specter that threatens to undo its hard-won legitimacy: the systematic scapegoating of fellow African nationals. The current wave of anti-migrant violence, orchestrated by movements such as Operation Doodler and March, represents not merely a spontaneous eruption of popular frustration, but a calculated political enterprise, a third hand, of strategic manipulation that threatens to isolate South Africa from the continent it helped to liberate. This analysis examines the structural, political, and economic forces that have enabled the mainstreaming of exclusionary politics in South Africa. It argues that the current xenophobic surge is fundamentally a product of electoral opportunism, amplified by the weakening of the African National Congress, ANC, and the fragmentation of the party system. The third hand, comprising opportunistic political parties, vigilante movements, and shadowy financiers, has identified African immigrants as the ideal scapegoat, vulnerable enough to attack without immediate geopolitical repercussions, yet visible enough to generate political mileage. The consequences of this strategy, however, extend far beyond electoral calculus. They threaten South Africa's regional standing, its economic ambitions under the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, and the very constitutional order that underpins its democratic experiment. The structural inheritance, apartheid's legacy of othering. To understand contemporary xenophobia in South Africa, one must first recognize its deep structural roots. Scholars have advanced various theoretical explanations for the persistence of anti-migrant sentiment in the post-apartheid era, emphasizing that xenophobia cannot be reduced to the conscious attitudes of individual actors. Rather, it emerges from a constellation of systemic forces: historical residues of othering, the neoliberal political economy, an exclusionary state, and negative media representations of refugees and migrants. The apartheid system deliberately engineered racial hierarchies and divided African people along ethnic and national lines. This legacy of division did not simply disappear with the advent of democracy in 1994. The rainbow nation ideology, while noble in its aspirations, struggled to overcome the deep-seated psychological and structural barriers that apartheid had erected. South Africa's prolonged isolation from the international community during the apartheid era fostered a peculiar form of exceptionalism, a sense that the country existed in a vacuum, detached from the broader African continent. This psychological distance from continental neighbors has created a blind spot regarding shared historical struggles and future opportunities, making it easier for political entrepreneurs to frame fellow Africans as threats rather than partners. The political economy of desperation. South Africa's contemporary xenophobia cannot be divorced from its profound economic crisis. The country's unemployment rate consistently exceeds 30%, with youth unemployment reaching between 57 and 62.4%, among the highest in the world. Extreme inequality, slow service delivery, corruption, and decaying infrastructure have created a fertile ground for scapegoating. When local workers feel squeezed by competition for scarce jobs and resources, the resulting friction often boils over into street protests and violence against foreign nationals. Yet the economic logic that underpins anti-migrant sentiment is fundamentally flawed. Official statistics indicate that migrants make up less than 5% of South Africa's population, approximately 3 million people. Campaigners who claim figures 10 times higher rely on implausible estimates that serve to inflame public anxiety rather than illuminate reality. Moreover, the sectors in which undocumented migrants predominantly work, agriculture, construction, domestic work, hospitality, and informal trading, are precisely those that many South African workers are either unwilling or unequipped to fill. Migrant workers in these sectors form the unacknowledged backbone of the economy. They build homes, harvest food, and sustain households, yet their contributions remain largely invisible in national discourse. This economic paradox, the simultaneous dependence on and hostility toward migrant labor, represents one of the central contradictions of South African political economy. Employers across multiple sectors rely on undocumented workers to maintain low costs and flexibility, yet political entrepreneurs exploit public frustration with these very workers to generate electoral support. The result is a system in which the structural demand for cheap labor is rendered invisible while the workers themselves are rendered vulnerable. Cycles of violence, 2008, 2015, 2019, and beyond. The current wave of anti-migrant violence is not without precedent. Since the end of apartheid, South Africa has experienced recurrent outbreaks of xenophobic violence, with major spikes in 2008, 2015, and 2019. The 2008 attacks killed at least 62 people and displaced tens of thousands. Subsequent outbreaks in 2015 and 2019 resulted in additional deaths, widespread displacement, and damage to property worth hundreds of millions of rands. These cycles of violence have followed a predictable pattern: economic anxiety, political exploitation, vigilante mobilization, state inaction, and eventual condemnation, followed by a return to the status quo until the next crisis emerges. What distinguishes the current wave is its organizational sophistication. Movements like Operation Dudula, whose name translates to "force out" in isiZulu, have evolved from grassroots community groups into quasi-political forces with nationwide branches, organizing marches, business raids, and blockades of clinics and schools. Operation Dudula formally registered as a political party in 2023 and announced plans to contest the 2026 municipal elections. March and March, founded in 2025 by former radio presenter Jacinta Ngobi Zuma, has similarly mobilized thousands of supporters behind an anti-immigration platform. These movements have been joined by a number of conservative political parties, including Action SA, the Patriotic Alliance, and the Umkhonto we Sizwe (MK) party, all of which have taken hard-right positions on migration and national identity. The human cost of this trajectory is not abstract. In one documented incident, a 1-year-old Malawian boy died after Operation Dudula blocked him from accessing treatment at 2 local government clinics in Alexandra because his family lacked a South African identity card. In another, videos showed vigilantes beating a man accused of being undocumented in front of a supermarket in Durban. At least 7 people have been killed since the protests began in April 2026. More than 25,000 people fled the country in the run-up to the June 30 deadline, set by campaign groups for migrants to leave. Mozambique reported that 5 of its nationals were killed in anti-foreigner violence in May, and Ghana reported the killing of one of its citizens. The fragmentation of the political landscape. The emergence of organized xenophobic movements must be understood within the context of South Africa's rapidly fragmenting political landscape. The 2024 national elections marked a watershed moment in the country's democratic history. The ANC, which had held an unassailable majority since 1994, secured just 40.2% of the national vote, a decline of more than 17% from the 2019 elections. This historic defeat, the party's worst electoral showing since the advent of democracy, forced the ANC into a government of national unity, NU, comprising 10 political parties, including the Democratic Alliance, DA, the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, the Patriotic Alliance, PA, and others. The NU, while intended to provide stability, has instead exposed the deep fractures within South African politics. Tensions over key policy areas, VAT increases, national health insurance, land expropriation, and language education, have tested the cohesion of the coalition. At the provincial level, coalition politics has taken root in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Northern Cape, each with its own unique dynamics and power-sharing arrangements. The ANC, while retaining a dominant role within the coalition, continues to struggle with the complexities of equitable power-sharing, particularly in relation to the DA. This fragmentation has created an environment in which smaller parties and extra-parliamentary movements can gain disproportionate influence by championing populist issues. Anti-immigration sentiment has become an increasingly attractive issue for opposition parties and activist groups seeking to distinguish themselves in a crowded field. The Patriotic Alliance, for example, has been steadfast in its message on immigration and mass deportation. Action's leader, Herman Mashaba, has justified his party's participation in anti-migrant marches by citing a vacuum left by a government too slow to act. The MK party, led by former President Jacob Zuma, has been accused of fueling hostility towards Africans by endorsing slogans such as Mabahambe, they must go. Part 2, Electoral Incentives, Populism, Migration Economics, and the third-hand hypothesis. Electoral behavior and the populist temptation. The mainstreaming of xenophobic politics in South Africa cannot be understood without examining the electoral incentives that drive political actors to embrace exclusionary rhetoric. In a context of deepening economic anxiety, fragmented party competition, and weakening institutional trust, anti-immigration sentiment offers a low-cost, high-reward strategy for political mobilization. It requires no complex policy solutions, no costly institutional reforms, and no confrontation with powerful economic interests. It merely requires the identification of a vulnerable outgroup and the amplification of popular grievances. Political scientists have long recognized that populist movements thrive in environments characterized by economic insecurity, institutional decay, and perceived elite failure. South Africa in 2026 exhibits all of these conditions. The unemployment crisis, the legacy of corruption, the failures of service delivery, and the palpable sense that the political establishment has failed to deliver on the promises of liberation have created a reservoir of resentment that populist entrepreneurs are eager to tap. As The Guardian editorial observed, poorer South Africans are right to be angry at the state of the country, but wrong about who is to blame. These are problems of South Africa's own making, the bitter legacy of apartheid, and subsequent corruption and mismanagement. The electoral logic is straightforward. Ahead of the November 2026 local government elections, anti-illegal immigration is poised to become a significant issue, potentially influencing how some voters cast their ballots. Internal polling suggests that the ANC and the DA are both likely to lose ground in the local elections, creating opportunities for smaller parties and independent candidates to make gains. Parties that are perceived as tough on immigration, Action SA, the Patriotic Alliance, the MK Party, and Operation Doodler, stand to benefit from this shift in voter sentiment, just like what happened in 2025 general elections. The third-hand hypothesis, strategic scapegoating. The central thesis of this analysis is that the current wave of xenophobic violence is not a spontaneous expression of popular frustration but a strategically orchestrated political enterprise, a third hand, of manipulation that serves the interests of political entrepreneurs, vigilante organizers, and their financiers. This hypothesis is supported by the organizational sophistication of the anti-migrant movements, their coordination with political parties, and the timing of their mobilization in advance of the local elections. The third hand operates according to a clear calculus. Its organizers understand that if they were to direct their incendiary rhetoric toward white farmers or European immigrants, the geopolitical and economic repercussions would be immediate and severe. The West would likely impose sanctions, capital would flee, and the international community would condemn South Africa in terms that would resonate globally. The historical experience of Zimbabwe and other African countries that have targeted white minorities serves as a cautionary tale. The economic costs of such a strategy are prohibitive. African immigrants, by contrast, offer a soft target. They have no powerful consulates threatening sanctions, no international media bloc to defend them, and no capacity to impose meaningful costs on the South African state. They are the ideal scapegoat, visible enough to generate political mileage, yet vulnerable enough to attack without immediate geopolitical consequences. The fact that the vast majority of those targeted are black African migrants, a phenomenon that South African courts have termed xenoracism, underscores the racial and national dimensions of this hostility. The political economy of protest, marching as a revenue stream. Beyond the electoral calculus lies an even more concrete operational reality. The organizers of these xenophobic outbursts are treating violence and mobilization as a revenue stream. The more marches, the more rallies, and the more vigilante patrols they stage, the more funding flows from shadowy third forces with opaque agendas. Every mass gathering is a political opportunity monetized, a chance for party leaders, ward councillors, and vigilante coordinators to collect payouts, consolidate patronage networks, and justify their continued existence to their financiers. This phenomenon reflects a broader pattern in South African politics. The commercialization of protest and the emergence of a protest industry, in which political entrepreneurs generate income through the organization of mass mobilization. The anti-migrant movements have mastered this model, staging increasingly frequent and increasingly violent demonstrations that generate media attention, political leverage, and financial rewards for their organizers. The March and March movement, in particular, has demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for sustained mobilization. Its leader, Jacinta Ngobi Zuma, has emerged as one of the country's most prominent anti-immigrant figures. The movement's ability to organize nationwide protests, coordinate with political parties, and maintain momentum over an extended period suggests significant organizational capacity and financial backing. When the inevitable global backlash, economic contraction, and continental isolation finally arrive, these same organizers will perform a masterclass in plausible deniability. They will distance themselves from the violence, claim they were merely expressing legitimate concerns, and leave the grassroots foot soldiers, the same poor, uneducated masses they incited, to face the full weight of the law and the economic ruin they helped create. By then, the organizers will have made their killing, both literally and figuratively. The economic evidence: migration and labor markets. The economic case against the anti-migrant movements is compelling, yet it is systematically ignored by those who stand to benefit from xenophobic mobilization. The available evidence suggests that undocumented migrants play a crucial role in sustaining key sectors of the South African economy, and that their removal would have devastating consequences for the very communities that are currently demanding their expulsion. Civil society and academic estimates of the undocumented migrant population vary widely, from 2.5 to over 5 million people. This wide range reflects a fundamental data gap. South Africa has not conducted a comprehensive national audit of migration flows in over a decade. There is no integrated system tracking who enters, who stays, or how movements across borders intersect with labor markets, infrastructure pressure, or regional development. This absence of reliable data is not merely an administrative gap, it is an entrenched institutional blind spot that weakens governance, inflames public anxiety, and erodes credibility in a continent that is moving towards integration through data. What is known is that undocumented migrants overwhelmingly concentrate in economic sectors characterized by informality, low wages, and conditions that documented South African workers are typically unwilling or unable to accept: street trading, informal construction, domestic work, agriculture, and small-scale retail. In Johannesburg's inner city, 44% of informal traders are foreign nationals. In the agricultural sector, migrant farm workers remain trapped in exploitative labor systems shaped by historical and contemporary forces. In the construction sector, migrant workers have become central to sustaining low-cost, high-demand labor markets. In domestic work, migrant women navigate restrictive immigration regimes that deny them work permits, forcing many into irregular status. The economic contribution of these workers is substantial, yet it remains largely invisible in national discourse. As one observer noted, agriculture, construction, domestic work, hospitality, these sectors do not function at their current scale without migration. The irony is bitter and sharp. The same politicians who chant, "they must go," are well aware that if these migrants vanished overnight, food prices would skyrocket, basic services would grind to a halt, and the informal trade ecosystem that sustains millions of South African households would implode. They choose to ignore this economic reality because acknowledging it does not win votes. Xenophobia does. The mainstreaming of exclusionary politics. What is particularly troubling about the current wave of anti-migrant sentiment is the extent to which exclusionary politics have been mainstreamed behind the respectability of policy language. There has been a significant effort aimed at reframing Afrophobia as an effort to restore law and order, with a visible shift from using derogatory terms to the legalese of illegal alien and undocumented immigrants. This new language is not accidental. It is employed to disarm potential critics of xenophobia. As one analysis observed, what we are witnessing is the mainstreaming of exclusionary politics behind the respectability of policy language. The ANC itself has contributed to this mainstreaming, going from condemning xenophobia to putting anti-immigrant rhetoric and the discussion about migration as a security threat into the white paper on citizenship, immigration and refugee protection. This shift reflects a broader pattern of political accommodation to xenophobic sentiment, driven by the electoral calculations of a weakened ruling party. The silencing of reason. At this moment, however, the voice of reason falls on deaf ears. The poor, the politically ambitious, and the desperate are entirely blinded by the short-term temporal benefits of this wave. They refuse to label it xenophobia or Afrophobia, preferring euphemisms like illegal migration control or economic justice to legitimize their pillaging. They benefit, in the moment, from looting the shops of their fellow Africans, from the psychological dopamine of perceived power, and from the small payouts handed down by the organizers. They do not want to hear the truth because the truth, that they are being used as cannon fodder, is too painful to accept. They want to legitimize their actions because, for now, the spoils feel real. But the consequences will come. When they do, we will mourn what we have lost, and the organizers will have already cashed their checks. Part 3: The ANC's Strategic Dilemma, Constitutional Implications, and South Africa's Geopolitical Future. The ANC surrender to populism. The most alarming aspect of the current crisis is the ANC's complicity through inaction. A government of national unity is supposed to represent stability, yet the ANC is acting less like a ruling party and more like the opposition. To survive and avoid losing more seats in the November 2026 local elections, it is pandering to the xenophobic wave, failing to robustly arrest and prosecute the vigilantes who are terrorizing foreign nationals. This is not leadership, it is cowardice dressed as political survival. By refusing to crack down on the violent mobs, the ANC has given a green light to lawlessness. It is sacrificing the rights of millions of African migrants to appease a small, vocal segment of the electorate. The pattern is clear. When the state fails to enforce the law, vigilantes fill the vacuum. When the state fails to prosecute perpetrators, violence becomes normalized. When the state fails to defend the vulnerable, the constitutional order itself is undermined. The courts have been forced to intervene where the executive has been unwilling. In November 2025, Judge Lester Adams of the Johannesburg High Court interdicted Operation Doodler and its leaders from intimidating, harassing, or assaulting individuals identified as non-citizens, and from publishing any statements on social media that constitute hate speech. The court's intervention was necessary, but the fact that litigation had to travel as far as it did before meaningful accountability arrived tells its own story about the state's reluctance to act. Constitutional implications: the erosion of state legitimacy. The rise of xenophobic vigilantism represents a profound challenge to South Africa's constitutional order. The constitution guarantees the rights of all people within the country's borders, regardless of their citizenship status. The right to healthcare, education, and dignity are not contingent on documentation. Yet vigilante groups have systematically blocked migrants from accessing these services, and the state has been slow to intervene. The erosion of state legitimacy is perhaps the most dangerous long-term consequence of this crisis. When citizens take the law into their own hands, when vigilantes establish illegal checkpoints, when mobs beat and loot with impunity, the state's monopoly on violence is broken. This erosion of state authority creates a vicious cycle. As the state becomes less capable of enforcing the law, citizens lose confidence in its capacity to protect them, leading to further vigilantism and further state retreat. The constitutional implications extend beyond the immediate crisis of violence. The mainstreaming of exclusionary politics threatens to normalize discrimination against foreign nationals, eroding the cosmopolitan values that underpin the constitutional order. As one human rights organization noted, in a country founded on the rejection of apartheid, we cannot allow ourselves to be subjected to the xenophobic hate promoted by Operation Doodler. The ethnic dimension, Zulu nationalism and the politics of exclusion. Within this toxic mix lies the rise of ethnic chauvinism, primarily manifested in parts of KwaZulu-Natal. There is a resurgence of a militant Zulu nationalism that seeks to assert dominance, not just over foreign nationals, but over other South African tribes. The violent attempts to enforce Zulu fluency and cultural superiority are a throwback to the dark days of 19,911,994, when the province was engulfed in political violence. The logic is perverse. First, you purge the foreigner, then, you turn on the other from within. If the trend continues, South Africa is walking headlong into a tragedy where the outsider status will be redefined to include anyone who is not Zulu enough. The poor, uneducated masses who are currently wielding weapons in the name of economic freedom will soon find that they are the next targets, as the elite political manipulators sit in their ivory towers and watch the disenfranchised cannibalize themselves. This ethnic dimension adds a particularly dangerous layer to the crisis. South Africa's history is scarred by ethnic violence, and the resurgence of ethnic nationalism threatens to reopen wounds that have only partially healed. The MK Party's rejection of tribalism and xenophobia in public statements is belied by its association with movements that promote both. The ANC itself has struggled to contain the ethnic tensions that have emerged within its own ranks, particularly between supporters of President Cyril Ramaphosa and former President Jacob Zuma. Regional diplomacy, the straining of continental relations. The diplomatic consequences of South Africa's xenophobic surge are already being felt across the continent. Ghana has formally requested that the African Union place the issue of xenophobic attacks in South Africa on the agenda of its upcoming mid-year coordination meeting. The government of Ghana has described the recurring incidents as particularly troubling, and has called for a thorough probe into the violence. Ghana has also summoned South Africa's acting High Commissioner to protest incidents involving Ghanaian nationals. Nigeria has urged its citizens in South Africa to exercise caution and remain indoors during protests, even though this did not help and vigilantes broke into houses and flashed him out. Other African countries have expressed growing concern about the safety of their nationals in South Africa, and some have begun to repatriate their citizens. The broader African sentiment views the attacks as contradicting Pan-African ideals and undermining the continent's integration project. The diplomatic fallout extends beyond bilateral relations. Persistent xenophobic tensions risk weakening key continental frameworks such as the AfCFTA, which depends on trust, mobility, and cooperation among member states. As one African official warned, persistent xenophobic tensions risk weakening key continental frameworks such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, which depends on trust, mobility, and cooperation among member states. Some African civil society groups have gone so far as to petition for the removal of the AfCFTA Secretary-General over the failure to address xenophobic attacks in South Africa. South Africa's geopolitical future, isolation or integration. The trajectory on which South Africa is currently embarked leads inexorably toward continental isolation. The country's status as the gateway to Africa will evaporate if it continues to attack the very citizens of the continent it seeks to lead. The AfCFTA's $50 trillion market potential, built on the free movement of people and goods, assumes that member states can at least measure who is moving. At present, South Africa cannot meet that assumption. The cost of this isolation would be immense. Foreign direct investment in South Africa has already fluctuated due to political uncertainty and social unrest. Persistent xenophobic tensions signal a lack of social contract, deterring capital from other African nations and creating a ripple effect that slows development across the region. The next generation of African leaders will look north, east, and west for investment and partnership, bypassing a country that attacks its own brothers. The South African government's response to these diplomatic pressures has been inadequate. President Cyril Ramaphosa has condemned xenophobia and warned against prejudice toward fellow Africans. He has also, however, denied that South Africa is experiencing xenophobic attacks, describing incidents as isolated, and insisting that there are no xenophobic attacks. This denial of reality serves only to undermine South Africa's credibility and to signal to the international community that the government is unwilling to confront the problem honestly. The Government of National Unity's migration policy dilemma. The NU faces an uphill battle on migration policy. The coalition brings together parties with fundamentally different approaches to migration, from the DA's relatively liberal stance to the Patriotic Alliance's anti-immigration position. Finding common ground on migration governance is essential, yet the political incentives for the parties within the NU pull in opposite directions. The ANC's position is particularly problematic. Having lost its majority, the party is desperate to retain support among its traditional bases. Anti-immigration sentiment is strongest among poorer South Africans, who have been hardest hit by unemployment and service delivery failures. By adopting a tougher stance on migration, the ANC hopes to stem the flow of voters to smaller parties that have championed anti-immigration causes. Yet in doing so, it legitimizes the very xenophobic rhetoric that threatens to undermine the constitutional order. The DA, as the second largest party in the GNU, has sought to position itself as a voice of reason on migration. DA leader Jordan Hill-Lewis has stated that the party will support every lawful effort in the Government of National Unity and fix the broken systems that have allowed illegal migration to become a source of fear and frustration. However, the DA's participation in the NU has also exposed it to criticism from its own base, which has grown increasingly skeptical of coalitions with the ANC. Part 4, Future Scenarios, Policy Recommendations, and a Concluding Synthesis. Future Scenarios, Trajectories of Crisis. The current trajectory of South African politics suggests several possible futures, none of them entirely encouraging. Scenario 1, Escalation and state collapse. In this scenario, the anti-migrant movements continue to escalate their violence, the state continues to fail to respond effectively, and the violence spreads to other targets, first to other African nationals, then to other South African ethnic groups, and eventually to any group that can be scapegoated for the country's woes. The economy contracts as foreign investment flees and regional trade collapses. The constitutional order is progressively eroded as vigilantism replaces the rule of law. South Africa becomes a pariah on the continent, isolated from the very integration project it helped to create. Scenario 2, Electoral realignment. In this scenario, the anti-migration parties make significant gains in the November 2026 local elections, further fragmenting the political landscape and weakening the new. The ANC's vote share drops to as low as 30%. The resulting political instability makes coherent migration policy impossible, and the violence continues, albeit at a lower intensity. South Africa's regional standing continues to decline, but the country does not entirely collapse. Scenario 3. State reassertion. In this scenario, the state belatedly reasserts its authority, prosecuting vigilante leaders, deploying police to protect vulnerable communities, and implementing a coherent migration policy that balances enforcement with the recognition of migrants' economic contributions. This scenario requires political will that is currently lacking, but it is not impossible. It would require the ANC and its new partners to prioritize the rule of law over short-term electoral calculations. Scenario 4. Regional intervention. In this scenario, the African Union and neighboring states intervene diplomatically and economically to pressure South Africa to address its xenophobic violence. Sanctions or trade restrictions are imposed, forcing the South African government to take the crisis seriously. This scenario is possible but unlikely, given the African Union's limited enforcement capacity and the reluctance of member states to confront Africa's largest economy. Policy recommendations. Addressing the current crisis requires a multi-pronged approach that tackles the structural, political, and economic drivers of xenophobic violence. First, law enforcement must be strengthened. The state must arrest and prosecute vigilante leaders and their financiers. Courts must continue to interdict xenophobic activities, and the state must enforce these court orders. As The Guardian editorial observed, anti-migrant mobilization is not only about frustrated communities. It is a political enterprise co-produced by vigilante groups and the state through acts of commission and omission, including the failure to censure violence adequately. Breaking this cycle of state complicity is essential. Police have been seen to participate with these groups, where groups invade homes and bring foreigners to the police and the police does not arrest these criminal elements. Second, migration policy must be reformed. The 2025 White Paper on Labour Migration represents an opportunity to modernize South Africa's migration framework. However, critics have questioned whether sector-specific quotas and labour market testing will genuinely balance local employment priorities with the country's need for skilled labour. Legal experts have warned of possible constitutional challenges, and migration researchers have cautioned that the policy overlooks the informal and undocumented labour force, leaving millions of workers outside formal protection. A reformed migration policy must recognize the economic contribution of undocumented workers while providing pathways to regularization. Third, data collection must be improved. South Africa cannot govern what it cannot see. The absence of reliable migration data allows political actors to use migration as a rhetorical device, one that can distract from policy failures when evidence is lacking. A functional labor market information system that connects cross-border movement data to national planning is essential. Fourth, economic grievances must be addressed. The scapegoating of migrants distracts from systemic governance failures, including corruption, austerity, and inefficiency, that truly strain public resources. Addressing unemployment, inequality, and service delivery failures is essential to reducing the appeal of xenophobic populism. Fifth, political leadership is required. The ANC and its new partners must demonstrate the courage to stand against xenophobia, even when it is politically inconvenient. As The Guardian editorial argued, leaders should have the courage to say so more clearly. This means condemning xenophobia unequivocally, prosecuting perpetrators, and defending the constitutional rights of all people within South Africa's borders. Sixth, regional diplomacy must be prioritized. South Africa must repair its damaged relationships with African neighbors and demonstrate a genuine commitment to Pan-African solidarity. This means acknowledging the reality of xenophobic violence, rather than denying it, and working with the African Union and other regional bodies to address the crisis. Concluding synthesis. South Africa stands at a defining moment. The current wave of xenophobic violence is not a spontaneous expression of popular frustration, but a strategically orchestrated political enterprise, a third hand, of manipulation that serves the interests of political entrepreneurs, vigilante organizers, and their financiers. The organizers of this violence understand that African immigrants are the ideal scapegoat, vulnerable enough to attack without immediate geopolitical consequences, yet visible enough to generate political mileage. The consequences of this strategy extend far beyond electoral calculus. They threaten South Africa's regional standing, its economic ambitions under the AfCFTA, and the very constitutional order that underpins its democratic experiment. They threaten to isolate South Africa from the continent it helped to liberate, to undermine the trust and cooperation that are essential for regional integration, and to erode the rule of law that is the foundation of the constitutional order. The ANC's complicity through inaction is perhaps the most alarming aspect of the current crisis. A government of national unity is supposed to represent stability, yet the ANC is acting less like a ruling party and more like the opposition. To survive and avoid losing more seats, it is pandering to the xenophobic wave, failing to robustly arrest and prosecute the vigilantes who are terrorizing foreign nationals. This is not leadership, it is cowardice dressed as political survival. The vulnerable always suffer the most. In this case, the vulnerable are both the foreign nationals being attacked and the impoverished South Africans being manipulated. When the country's economy collapses and international isolation sets in, the suffering will not be felt by the politicians who stoke the fires. It will be felt by the very poor and uneducated who were used as pawns. They will lose their jobs when foreign capital leaves. They will lose their social grants when the tax base shrinks. They will starve when the informal trading networks they rely on are destroyed. The ANC and the opposition need to understand a simple truth. You cannot burn down the house to get rid of the guests and expect to survive the winter. It is time for the government to act with an iron fist against the vigilantes, regardless of political cost. If they do not, history will judge them not just as failures, but as accomplices to a national suicide. The chicken will come home to roost. When the consequences materialize, we will mourn what we have lost, and the organizers will have already cashed their checks. The question is whether South Africa will recognize the danger in time to change course, or whether it will continue down this suicidal path until it is too late.